Lehi in the Desert, Chapter 4. Desert Ways and Places. Lehi's Altar. As his first act, once his tent had been pitched for his first important camp, Lehi built an altar of stones, and made an offering unto the Lord, and gave thanks to the Lord. It is for all the world as if he had been reading Robertson Smith. The ordinary artificial mark of a Semitic sanctuary, Hebrew as well as Arabic, that is the sacrificial pillar, cairn, or rude altar, upon which sacrifices are presented to the god. In Arabia we find no proper altar, but in its place a rude pillar or heap of stones, beside which the victim is slain. It was at this same altar of stones that Lehi and his family did offer sacrifice and burnt offerings, and they gave thanks unto the God of Israel upon the safe return of his sons from their dangerous expedition to Jerusalem. When Razwan reports, a baby camel was brought up to Mishael's tent as a sacrifice offer in the honor of the safe return of Boaz, we cannot help thinking of some such scene before the tent of Lehi on the safe return of his sons. This is what the Arabs call a thabisat al-Qasab, a sacrifice to celebrate the successful return of warriors, hunters, and raiders to the camp. This sacrifice, writes Yausen, is always in honor of an ancestor, and Nephi twice mentions the tribal ancestor Israel in his brief account. In the best desert manner, Lehi immediately after the Thanksgiving rites fell to examining the spoils. To this day the Bedouin makes sacrifice on every important occasion, not for magical and superstitious reasons, but because he lives under the constant impression of a higher force that surrounds him. St. Nelis, in the oldest known eyewitness account of life among the Arabs of the T, says, "They sacrifice on altars of crude stones piled together." That Lehi's was such an altar would follow not only from the ancient law demanding uncut stones in Exodus 20:25, but also from the Book of Mormon expression, an altar of stones, which is not the same thing as a stone altar. Such little heaps of stones, surviving from all ages, are still to be seen throughout the South Desert. The question arises, what about contacts on the desert? The Book of Mormon makes no mention of Lehi's people meeting any other party in their 8 years of wandering. Casual meetings with stray families of Bedouins then, as now, would merit no special attention. But how were they able to avoid any important contacts for 8 years and some 2,500 miles of wandering? One illuminating aside by Nephi explains everything. It was only after they reached the seashore, he says, that his people were able to make fires without danger. For the Lord had not hitherto suffered that we should make much fire, as we journeyed in the wilderness. For he said, I will make thy food become sweet, that ye cook it not, and I will also be your light in the wilderness. That tells all. I remember well, writes Bertram Thomas, taking part in a discussion upon the unhealthiness of campfires by night. We discontinued them forthwith in spite of the bitter cold. Major Chessman's guide would not even let him light a tiny lamp in order to jot down star readings, and they never dared build a fire on the open plain, where it would attract the attention of a prowling raiding party over long distances and invite a night attack. Once in a while, in a favorably sheltered depression, we dared to build a fire that could not be seen from a higher spot, writes Razwan. That is, fires are not absolutely out of the question, but rare and risky. Not much fire was Lehi's rule. And fires in the daytime are almost as risky as at night. Palgrave tells how his party were forced, lest the smoke of our fires should give notice to some distant rover, to content ourselves with dry dates instead of cooked food. So, of course, no fire means raw food. And what is one to do if one's diet is meat? Throughout the desert, writes Burkhardt, when a sheep or goat is killed, the persons present often eat the liver and kidneys raw, adding to it a little salt. Some Arabs of Yemen are said to eat raw not only those parts, but likewise whole slices of flesh, thus resembling the Abyssinians and the Druzes of Lebanon, who frequently indulge in raw meat, the latter to my own certain knowledge. Nelis, writing 14 centuries earlier, tells how the Bedouin of the T lives on the flesh of wild animals, failing which they slaughter a camel, one of their beasts of burden, and nourish themselves like animals from the raw meat, or else scorch the flesh quickly in a small fire to soften it sufficiently not to have to gnaw it like dogs. Only too well does this state of things match the grim economy of Lehi. They did suffer much for the want of food. We did live upon raw meat in the wilderness. All this bears out the conviction, supported by both modern experience and the evidence of archaeology, that Lehi was moving through a dangerous world. In ancient times, Jewish merchants traveling through the desert fell so often into the hands of Bedouin raiders that by the beginning of the Christian era their word for captor normally meant simply Arab. Arab inscriptions from Lehi's time show that in the peninsula there was constant unrest, even as in modern times. Ordinary times in the desert are bad times when, in the words of one of the oldest Arab poets, the honored men did not dare stay in the open country, and flight did not save the coward. A lonely life it is, writes Philby, a life of constant fear. Hunger is the rule of the desert. Hunger, danger, loneliness, fear, Lehi's people knew them all. Just what was the danger? The Arab tribes are in a state of almost perpetual war against each other. To surprise the enemy by a sudden attack and to plunder a camp are chief objects of both parties. Raiding to them is the spice of life. Might is right, and man ever walks in fear for his life and possessions. Lehi could ill afford to get embroiled in these perennial desert feuds, and yet he was everywhere a trespasser. The only way for him to stay out of trouble was to observe a rule which Thomas lays down for all travelers in the desert even today. An approaching party may be a friend, but is always assumed to be a foe. In the words of the ancient poet Zuhair, he who travels should consider his friend an enemy. Nelis describes Bedouins on the march in the 5th century as possessed by the same jittery nervousness and unbearable tension that makes the accounts of Chessman, Philby, Thomas, Palgrave, Burckhardt, and the others such exciting reading. At the merest sign of an armed man, he says, his Bedou fled in alarm as if seized by panic fear, and kept on fleeing. For fear makes them exaggerate danger and causes them to imagine things far beyond reality, magnifying their dread in every instance. Just so their modern descendants live always under the impression that an invasion is on the way, and every suspicious shadow or movement on the horizon calls their attention, according to the astute Boglansberger. This almost hysterical state of apprehension is actually a prime condition of survival in the desert. A Bedouin never tells his name, says the writer just quoted, nor his tribe, nor his business, nor the whereabouts of his people, even if he is in a friendly district. They are and must be very cautious. A word out of season may bring death and destruction. When the Bani Hilal migrate, it is under the darkness of night, under the obscuring veil of rain, bypassing settled places in darkness and in silence. What can better describe such a state of things than the Book of Mormon expression, a lonesome and a solemn people? Doughty said he had never met a merry man among the Arabs, and there is no humor in the Book of Mormon. This mood is hardly accidental. If the Hebrew gets his brooding qualities from his desert ancestors, why not the Lamanite? Sir Richard Burton, one of the few individuals who has ever known both the American Indian and the Bedouin Arab at first hand, was greatly impressed by their exact resemblance to each other, a resemblance so striking that he must warn his reader against attributing it to a common origin, explaining the perfect paralleling of temperament and behavior as due to the almost absolute independence of their way of life. Yet many equally independent tribesmen in other parts of the world in no way resemble these two. One of the writer's best friends is a venerable but enterprising Lebanese, who has spent many years both among the Bedouins of the desert and the Indians of New Mexico as a peddler and trader. He avers that there is absolutely no difference between the two races so far as manners and customs are concerned. Arabs now living in Utah, who have had some contact with Indians in the West, affirm the same thing with considerable emphasis. It is a nice problem for the sociologist, and the writer only mentions it because it has been brought to his attention innumerable times. There may be something to it. Lehi's party, as we have noted, were like the Beni Hilal trespassers wherever they walked. Every inch of the desert is claimed by some tribe or other that will demand the life of a trespasser. Marked boundaries do not exist, and it is natural that questions of ownership should be settled by fighting, which becomes an annual affair, while the looting of camels grows into a habit, according to Chessman. Hence the need for extreme caution and strict avoidance on Lehi's part. In most cases, says Jennings Bramley, Arabs do not think it prudent to allow the raiders near enough to decide whether they are friendly or not, and he describes a typical meeting in the desert. Both we and they were doing our best not to be seen. Of course, this thing leads to comic situations, ignoble panic, and ridiculous anticlimaxes. But in a game of life and death, one simply can't take chances, and Lehi was playing for the highest stakes. And so we are left with a picture of a wandering band sticking glumly to themselves for years on end, which, impossible as it seems to us, is a normal thing in the desert wastes, where the touchy, dangerous, unsocial Bedouin takes his stand as one of the most difficult, challenging, and fascinating creatures on earth. All of this leads us to examine family affairs. How do the members of such closed corporation hit it off among themselves? It is the domestic history that presents the real challenge to whoever would write a history of Bedouin life. To handle it convincingly would tax the knowledge of the best psychologist, and woe to him if he does not know the peculiar ways of the eastern desert, which surprise and trap the unwary Westerner at every turn. The ancient Hebrew family was a peculiar organization, self-sufficient and impatient of any authority beyond its own. These are obviously the very conditions, right Noack, which we can still observe today among the Bedouins. Thus, whether we turn to Hebrew or to Arabic sources for our information, the Book of Mormon must conform. Lehi feels no pangs of conscience at deserting Jerusalem, and when his sons think of home, it is specifically the land of their inheritance, their own family estate, for which they yearn. Not even Nephi evinces any loyalty to the Jews who were at Jerusalem, split up as they were into squabbling interest groups. Indeed, Nephi speaks of his history as an account of my proceedings and my reign and ministry, as if the wandering family recognized no government but that of its own head. This reminds one of the terms in which one of the earliest Bedouin poets, Ibn Kuthum, speaks of many a chief of a tribe, whom they had crowned with the crown of authority, and who protects those who seek refuge with him, as if every sheikh were truly a king. While Lehi lived, he was the sheikh, of course, and the relationship between him and his family, as described by Nephi, is accurate in the smallest detail. With the usual deft sureness and precision, the book shows Lehi leading, not ruling, his people by his persuasive eloquence and spiritual ascendancy alone, while his murmuring sons follow along exactly in the manner of Philby's Bedouins. An undercurrent of tension is in our ranks all day, and great difficulty to appease their evil, envious souls. We left Suwaika, says Burton, all of us in the crossest humors. So out of temper were my companions that at sunset of the whole party Omar Effendi was the only one who would eat supper. The rest sat upon the ground pouting and grumbling. Such a game at naughty children I have seldom seen played even by Oriental men. The character and behavior of Laman and Lemuel conform to the normal pattern. How true to the Bedouin way are their long, bitter, brooding, and dangerous outbreaks. How perfectly they resemble the Arabs of Lawrence, Doughty, Burton, and the rest in their sudden and complete changes of heart after their father has lectured them. Fiery anger yielding for the moment to a great impulse to humility and an overwhelming repentance, only to be followed by renewed resentment and more unhappy wrangling. They cannot keep their discontent to themselves, but are everlastingly murmuring. The fact that all that happens in an encampment is known, that all may be said to be nearly related to each other, renders intrigue almost impossible. We were all one family and friendly eyes, Doughty recollects, but then describes the other side of the picture. Arab children are ruled by entreaties. I have known an ill-natured child to lay a stick to the back of his good cherishing mother, and the Arabs say, many is the ill-natured lad among us that, an he be strong enough, will beat his own father. The fact that Laman and Lemuel were grown-up children did not help things. The daily quarrels between parents and children in the desert constitute the worst feature of the Bedouin character, says Burkhardt, and thus describes the usual source of the trouble. The son, arrived at manhood, is too proud to ask his father for any cattle. The father is hurt at finding that his son behaves with haughtiness towards him, and thus a breach is often made. The son, especially the eldest one, does not feel that he is getting what is coming to him, and behaves like the spoiled child he is. The father's attitude is described by Doughty, telling how a great sheikh dealt with his son. The boy, oft-times disobedient, he upbraided, calling him his life's torment, shaitan, only never menacing him, for that were far from a Bedouin father's mind. It is common, says Burkhardt, for mothers and sons to stick together in their frequent squabbles with the old man, in which the son is often expelled from the paternal tent for vindicating his mother's cause. Just so Sariah takes the part of her sons in chiding her own husband, making the same complaints against him that they did, and she rates him roundly when she thinks he has been the cause of their undoing. Is it any wonder that Laman and Lemuel worked off their pent-up frustration by beating their younger brother with a stick when they were once hiding in a cave? Every free man in the East carries a stick, the immemorial badge of independence and of authority, and every man asserts his authority over his inferiors by his stick, which shows that the holder is a man of position, superior to the workmen or day laborers. The government officials, superior officers, tax gatherers, and schoolmasters use this short rod to threaten, or if necessary to beat, their inferiors, whoever they may be. The usage is very ancient. A blow for a slave is the ancient maxim of Akbar, and the proper designation of an underling is Khabd al-Kasa, stick servant. This is exactly the sense in which Laman and Lemuel intended their little lesson to Nephi, For when the angel turned the tables, he said to them, Why do you smite your younger brother with a rod? Know ye not that the Lord has chosen him to be a ruler over you? All that saved Nephi's life on one occasion was the pleading of a daughter of Ishmael and her mother, another authentic touch, since the proud Semite may yield only to the entreaties of a woman without losing face. Burton recalls how even robbers will spare a victim who appeals to them in the name of his wife, the daughter of his uncle. Through it all, Laman, as the eldest son, is the nastiest actor. When only one boy is in the family, he is the tyrant, and his will dominates over all. So we see Laman still thinking to dominate over all, and driven mad that a younger brother should show superior talents. The rivalry between the sons of a sheikh often leads to bloody tragedies in the sheikh's household, and Nephi had some narrow escapes. The nature of Lehi's authority is clearly set forth in the Book of Mormon. Of the Arab sheikh, we have noted Burkhart's remark, his commands would be treated with contempt, but deference is paid to his advice. The real government of the Bedouins may be said to consist in the separate strength of their different families. The Arab can only be persuaded by his own relations. The sheikh's orders are never obeyed, but his example is generally followed. This is especially so on the march. While the tribe is in motion, the sheikh assumes all responsibility and the whole power of government. Yet in leading he gives no orders. When his tent is struck, it is the Rallah, and all the others without a word strike theirs. And when the place of encampment is reached, the sheikh puts his spear in the ground, and at once the tents are pitched. In the sheikh's tent the councils of the tribe are held, and all decisions concerning the journey are made. But no sheikh or council of Arabs can condemn a man to death, or even inflict a punishment. It can only, when appealed to, impose a fine. It cannot even enforce the payment of this fine. Why, then, if there was no power to compel them, did not Laman and Lemuel simply desert the camp and go off on their own, as discontented Arabs sometimes do? As a matter of fact, they tried to do just that in 1 Nephi 7 and 7, and in the end were prevented by the two things which, according to Philby, keep any wandering Bedouin party together: fear and greed. For they were greedy. They hoped for a promised land, and when they reached the sea without finding it, their bitter complaint was, Behold, these many years we have suffered in the wilderness, which time we might have enjoyed our possessions. And their position was precarious. Nephi pointed out to them the danger of returning to Jerusalem, and where would they go if they deserted their father? As we have seen with these people, family was everything, and the Arab or Jew will stick to his own people because they are all he has in the world. The family is the basic social organization, civil and religious, with the father at its head. To be without tribe or family is to forfeit one's identity on the earth. Nothing is more terrible than to be cut off, and that is exactly the fate that is promised Laman and Lemuel if they rebel. Within his own country, says an Arab proverb, the Bedouin is a lion. Outside of it, he is a dog. When the Lord has a task to be done, he picks a man who is most suited for the work by temperament and training. When Moses fled into Midian, he traveled afoot in the very deserts through which he was later to lead the children of Israel, and he lived and married among the people of the desert in whose way of life he was to instruct his own people. Lehi was no less prepared and qualified for his great task. Richly endowed with means and experience, wise in the ways of the desert, firm, resourceful, cautious, and unhurried, independent, and not to be intimidated, never provoking, though sorely provoked, he exemplifies what Philby has declared in a moving passage, that only the greatest strength of character in a leader can carry a party safely through a dangerous desert. For many days now I had endured the constant and inevitable friction of my own fixed and unalterable purpose, and the solid weight of the innate national inertia thrown into the balance against me by the united body of my companions. Step by step we had progressed, ever away from the home fires, but each step had been achieved only by the smallest margin, as the momentum of purposeful mind triumphed at each stage over the inert mass ever ready to recoil from any arduous objective. Those words might have been written to describe the achievement of Lehi. Had the Lord wished it, he could have transferred the whole party through the air. As it was, he apparently wanted them to do as much as possible on their own with a minimum of miraculous intervention. Of all the righteous men in Jerusalem, Lehi alone was singled out for a task requiring a combination of qualifications and a measure of faith which few men have ever had. But though Lehi was no ordinary man, one fact about him should begin to emerge at this point of our study: that he was an actual flesh-and-blood person in a real situation, and no synthetic and overdrawn character of romantic fiction moving among the phantasmagoric stage properties that were once thought to represent the gorgeous East. One thing that seems to fascinate people about the Book of Mormon is the description of characters and their complexions. Authorities on the East have often observed that the Arabic, and to a lesser extent the Jewish character, is remarkable for its two faces. On the one side, the Semite is thoroughly proud and noble, the soul of honor, the impeccable family man, the true friend faithful to death. And on the other, the low and cunning tramp, the sly assassin, dangerous companion and unpredictable rogue. Every page of Doughty reflects this strange paradox of the desert character, which has received its classic treatment in the 3rd chapter of Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Pure gold mixed with the basest dross, and all within a single family. And where can one find a better illustration of that than in Lehi's own household? For that matter, it comes near to being the leitmotif of the Book of Mormon. This amazing coincidentia oppositorum is the clash of black and white. With the Arabs, to be white of countenance is to be blessed, and to be black of countenance is to be cursed. There are parallel expressions in Hebrew and Egyptian. And what of Lehi's people? It is most significant that the curse against the Lamanites is the very same as that commonly held in the East to blight the sons of Ishmael, who appear to the light-skinned people of the towns as dark and loathsome, and a filthy people full of idleness and all manner of abominations, an idle people full of mischief and subtlety, etc. It is noteworthy that all the descendants of the Book of Mormon and Ishmael fall under the curse as if their Bedouin ancestry predisposed them to it. The Book of Mormon always mentions the curse of the dark skin in connection with and as a part of a larger picture. After they had dwindled in unbelief, they became a dark and loathsome and a filthy people, etc. Because of the cursing which was upon them, they did become an idle people, and did seek in the wilderness for beasts of prey. The statement that God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them describes the result, not the method, which is described elsewhere. Thus we are told in Alma that while the fallen people set the mark upon themselves, it was nonetheless God who was marking them. I will set a mark upon them, etc. So natural and human was the process that it suggested nothing miraculous to the ordinary observer, and the Amalekites knew not that they were fulfilling the words of God when they began to mark themselves. It was expedient that the curse should fall upon them, says Alma 3:18. Here God places his mark upon a people as a curse, yet it is an artificial mark, which they actually place upon themselves. The mark was not a racial thing, but was acquired by whosoever suffered himself to be led away by the Lamanites. Alma, moreover, it defines a Nephite as anyone observing the traditions of their fathers, which makes the difference between Nephite and Lamanite a cultural, not a racial one. Does this also apply to the dark skin? Note that the dark skin is never mentioned alone, but always as attending a generally depraved way of life, which also is described as the direct result of the curse. When the Lamanites become white again, it is by living among the Nephites as Nephites, i.e., adopting the Nephite way of life. The cultural picture may not be the whole story of the dark skin of the Lamanites, but it is an important part of that story, and is given great emphasis by the Book of Mormon itself. There is nowhere any mention of red skin, incidentally, but only of black or dark and white, the terms being used as the Arabs used them. An important item to consider is that of place names in the desert. The stream at which he first made camp, Lehi named after his eldest son, the valley after his second son. The oasis at which his party made their next important camp we did call Shazer. The fruitful land by the sea we called Bountiful, while the sea itself we called Iriantum. By what right do these people rename streams and valleys to suit themselves? No Westerner would tolerate such arrogance. But Lehi is not interested in Western taste. He is following a good old Oriental custom. Among the laws which no Bedouin would dream of transgressing, the first, according to Jennings Bramley, is that any water you may discover, either in your own territory or in the territory of another tribe, is named after you. So it happens that in Arabia a great wadi, or valley, will have different names at different points along its course, a respectable number of names being all used for one and the same valley. One and the same place may have several names, and the wadi running close to the same, or the mountains connected with it, will naturally be called differently by members of different clans. According to Canaan, who tells how the Arabs often coin a new name for a locality for which they have never used a proper name, or whose name they do not know, the name given being usually that of some person. However, names thus bestowed by wandering tribesmen are neither generally known or commonly used, so that we need not expect any of Lehi's place names to survive. Speaking of the desert below the Negev proper, i.e. the general area of Lehi's first camp, Woolley and Lawrence report peaks and ridges that have different names among the different Arab tribes and from different sides. And of the nearby T, Palmer says, in every locality, each individual object, whether rock, mountain, ravine, or valley, has its appropriate name, while Razwan recalls how miraculously each hill and dale bore a name. But how reliable are such names? Philby recounts a typical case. Zaid and Ali seemed a little vague about the nomenclature of these parts, and it was only by the irritating process of continual questioning and sifting their often inconsistent and contradictory answers that I was able in the end to piece together the topography of the region. Farther east, Chessman ran into the same difficulty. I pointed out that this was the third different hill to which he had given the same name. He knew that, was the reply, but that was how they named them. The irresponsible custom of renaming everything on the spot seems to go back to the earliest times, and probably, as often as not, the Israelites named for themselves their own camps, or unconsciously confounded a native name in their carelessness. Yet in spite of its undoubted antiquity, only the most recent explorers have commented on this strange practice, which seems to have escaped the notice of travelers until explorers in our own time started to make maps. Even more whimsical and senseless to a Westerner must appear the behavior of Lehi in naming a river after one son and its valley after another. But the Arabs don't think that way. In the Mahra country, for example, as is commonly the case in these mountains, the water bears a different name from the wadi. Likewise, we might suppose that after he had named the river after his firstborn, the location of the camp besides its water would be given, as any Westerner would give it, with reference to the river. Instead, the Book of Mormon follows the Arabic system of designating the camp not by the name of the river, which may easily dry up sometime, but by the name of the valley. Another surprise. Nephi more than once refers to the river of Laman as flowing into the fountain of the Red Sea. Since when is the Red Sea a fountain, forsooth? In the first place, we should note that Nephi does not call the Red Sea a fountain, but speaks of a body of water as a fountain of the Red Sea. To what can he be referring? In Hebrew, writes Albright, the word yam means large river and freshwater lake, as well as sea in the English sense. In our case, we cannot, however, be sure whether the designation yam came originally from inland, referring to pure fresh water as the source of life, or it referred to the Mediterranean as the main source of Canaanite livelihood. In the former case, fountain is the best translation of the word, and it is certainly in this inland sense that Nephi uses it, for he employs a totally different expression, as we shall see, when speaking of the ocean. The Nile and Euphrates were anciently called yams, and this has been explained as probably a kind of poetic hyperbole, founded upon the fact that they annually overflowed their banks. Now, the average width of the Gulf of Aqaba is only about 12 miles, and Musil reports that one can look right across it and see the Sinai Peninsula, not only the mountains of the southern part of the peninsula, but also the plain extending north. To the south, we had a view of the greater part of the At-Tihama, the southern Sinai shore. From the Arabian side, then, the long northeastern extension of the Red Sea for over 100 miles, that is, the section where Lehi's party possibly first came upon the sea, is not an open sea at all, and is not the Red Sea. It is a broad and elongated sheet of water, like the Nile and Euphrates at flood, and like them, it is not closed water, not a great lake, but opens out to the sea at its mouth, flowing out through two channels about 5 miles wide each. A glance at the map will show that there is a northwestern extension of the Red Sea also, closely resembling the one on the northeast. This western arm anciently had the mysterious and much discussed name of Yam Suf, sea or fountain of weeds or rushes. If it was called a yam, what is more natural than that its twin gulf to the east should bear the same designation? The latter certainly was what the ancients, by Albright's definition, called a yam, the word having, whether applied to salt water or fresh, the basic meaning of source or fountain. When Lehi's party first saw this body of water, it was a feeder of the Red Sea, with the spring torrents pouring into it, a yam, that is, in the very sense that the Nile and the Euphrates at flood were yams. When the travelers reached the ocean proper, we beheld the sea, Nephi recalls, which we called Iriantum, which, being interpreted, is many waters. But why did they not simply call it the sea, and be done? Obviously because there was no name in their language to designate this particular sea. The ancients' regular resort to epithets when speaking of the outer oceans, as the great green of the Egyptians and the great deep of the Hebrews. In Coptic, the last form of Egyptian, the Red Sea proper was called the Fayum Nehla, literally many waters. If one wanted to speculate, it would be easy to trace Iriantum back to some derivation containing the Egyptian ur, great, the Coptic nut, standing water, or to identify the final with the common in Egypt, Copt, Hebrew, yem, yam, yum, sea, and the rest of the word with the Coptic inahachte, great or many. But we need not go so far. It is enough to know that in Lehi's day the ocean was designated by epithets, and that the sea to the east was called Many Waters by the Egyptians. The first important stop after Lehi's party had left their base camp was at a place they called Shazer. The name is intriguing. The combination shayir is quite common in Palestinian place names. It is a collective meaning trees, and many Arabs, especially in Egypt, pronounce it shajur. It appears in Thorgret as sayur, the pass of trees, which is the ancient shahur, written Segor in the 6th century. It may be confused with shahur, seepage, which is held to be identical with Shihor, the Black River of Joshua 19:36. This last takes in western Palestine the form Sozura, suggesting the name of a famous water hole in South Arabia, called Shisur by Thomas and Shisar by Philby. It is a tiny copse, and one of the loneliest spots in all the world. So we have Shihor, Shahur, Shayur, Saghir, Segor, even Zoar, Shayar, Sozura, Shisur, and Shisar, all connected somehow or other, and denoting either seepage, a weak but reliable water supply, or a clump of trees. Whichever one prefers, Lehi's people could hardly have picked a better name for their first suitable stopping place than Shazer. When Ishmael died on the journey, he was buried in the place which was called Nahom. Note that this is not a place which we called Nahom, but the place which was so called, a desert burial ground. Yausen reports that though Bedouins sometimes bury the dead where they die, many carry the remains great distances to bury them. The Arabic root, consisting of NHM, has the basic meaning of to sigh or moan, and occurs nearly always in the third form, to sigh or moan with another. The Hebrew Nahum, comfort, is related, but that is not the form given in the Book of Mormon. At this place, we are told, the daughters of Ishmael did mourn exceedingly, and are reminded that among the desert Arabs, mourning rites are a monopoly of the women. One more note on rivers. Before leaving the subject of waters, it would be well to note that Nephi's mention of a river in a most desolate part of Arabia has caused a good deal of quite unnecessary eyebrow-raising. Though Hogarth says that Arabia probably never had a true river in all its immense area, later authorities, including Philby, are quite convinced that the peninsula has supported some quite respectable rivers even in historic times. The point to notice, however, is that Lehi made his discovery in the spring of the year, for Nephi's story begins at the commencement of the first year of the reign of Zedekiah and moves very rapidly. With the Jews and in the Bible throughout, the first month always refers to the first spring month. In the spring, the desert mountains are full of rushing torrents, say nothing. The very fact that Nephi uses the term a river of water, to say nothing of Lehi's ecstasies at the sight of it, shows that they were used to thinking in terms of dry rivers, the rivers of sand of the east. The biblical expression rivers of waters illustrates the point nicely, for the word for river in this case is none of the conventional ones, but the rare afek, meaning gully or channel. This is in Ezekiel 32:6. In one of the instances where rivers of waters are mentioned in the Bible, the river was actually dried up in Joel 1:20. In another, they contain not water, but also wine and milk, Joel 3:18, and in a third, Song of Solomon's 5:12, the proper rendering, as in many modern translations, is water brooks. One only speaks of rivers of water in a country where rivers do not run all the time. But in the spring it is by no means unusual to find rivers in the regions through which Lehi was moving, as a few examples will show. We descended into the Wadi Wallah. Here was a beautiful sail, quite a little river, dashing over the rocky bed and filled with fish. The stream is a very pretty one, bordered by thickets of flowering oleanders. Here and there it narrows into a deep rushing torrent. Describing the great wall that runs all along the east side of the Dead Sea, the Arabah, and the Red Sea, an earlier traveler says, farther south the country is absolutely impassable, as huge gorges 1,000 to 1,500 feet deep and nearly a mile wide in some places, compare Lehi's awful chasm, are broken by the great torrents flowing in winter over perpendicular precipices into the sea. The sea is the Dead Sea, but the same conditions continue all down the Great Wall to the borders which are near the Red Sea. One is reminded of how impressed Lehi was when he saw the river of Laman flowing into the fountain of the Red Sea. On the desert road to Petra in the springtime there are several broad streams to pass, the fording of which creates a pleasant little excitement. A party traveling farther north reports, "We presently came upon the deep Wadi Alan, which here cuts the plain in two. How delightful was the splash and gurgle of the living water rushing over its rocky bed in the fierce heat of that Syrian day." Given the right season of the year, then, and the Book of Mormon is obliging enough to give it, one need not be surprised at rivers in northwestern Arabia. It was this seasonal phenomenon that led Ptolemy to place a river between Yambu and Mecca with perfect correctness. That valuable researcher and indefatigable sleuth, Ariel L. Crowley, has suggested with considerable astuteness that the river of Laman was a very different kind of stream from the rivers of water of which we have been speaking, being nothing less than Necho's canal from the Nile to the Red Sea. The greater part of Brother Crowley's study is devoted to proving that there was such a canal, but that is no issue, since it is not disputed. What we cannot believe is that the Big Ditch was Laman's river, and that for a number of reasons which we need here only give two. First, while noting that Nephi's account of the Exodus is so precisely worded that it bears the stamp of deliberate, careful phrasing, Crowley fails to note that nothing is more precise and specific than Nephi's report on the direction of the march, and that, as we have seen, he never mentions a westerly direction, which must have been taken to reach the place. Brother Crowley assumes that into the wilderness means by the wilderness way to Egypt, first for the sake of hypothesis, and then without proof as a fact. There is no expression commoner in the East than into the wilderness, which of course is not restricted to any such area. The last place in the world to flee from the notice of men would be to the border of Egypt, which at all times in ancient history was very heavily fortified and closely guarded. See the story of Sinuhe. And Lehi, as a member of the anti-Egyptian party, would be the last man in the world to seek refuge in Egypt. Secondly, Crowley calls Necho's canal a mighty stream, and says that it lay at the ancient crossroads of continents, perhaps as well known as any place on earth in 600 B.C. Then why wasn't it known to Lehi? It was the greatest engineering triumph of the age, the most important purely commercial waterway in the world. It lay astride the most traveled highway of antiquity, if not of history. Reached by a few days' journey from Jerusalem over a level coastal plain, it was the only great river anywhere near Jerusalem except for the Nile, of which it was a branch. And yet the stream was unknown to Lehi, otherwise it is improbable that he would have given it a new name. In this very fact, says Crowley, lies confirmation of the recent creation of the stream. Just how long does it take news to travel in the East? The canal was at least 10 years old. It had taken years to build, a wonder of the world, an inestimable boon to world trade, less than 200 miles from Lehi's doorstep by a main highway, and yet at a time of ceaseless and feverish coming and going between Egypt and Palestine, neither Lehi, the great merchant with his sound Egyptian education, nor his enterprising and ambitious sons had ever heard of it. It is impossible to believe that Lehi did not know that if one traveled towards Egypt and came across a mighty stream in a perfectly empty desert, it would not be some unknown and undiscovered watercourse, but really quite an important one. If anyone knew about Necho's canal, it was Lehi. But we agree with Crowley that the river of Laman was obviously not known to him. Therefore the two cannot have been the same. No river answering the description of Nephi could have escaped historical notice in profane works, says Crowley. Why not? It escaped Lehi's notice, steeped as he was in the lore of Egyptians and Jews. It cannot therefore have been an important stream, let alone one of the most remarkable on earth, or Lehi would have known about it. Nor does Nephi ever say or imply that it was a great river. It was not a waterway at all, but a river of water, which is a very different thing.